Hey, a couple thoughts before we open up our Bibles. Number one, Easter's coming up. And it's always fascinating to me. We have lots of people that come for the first time. And so if like you're kind of a veteran of this place, would you consider either coming to one of the Saturday night services or incentivized by donuts? Come at 8 a.m., okay? I was like, no, people won't come just if there's donuts, are there? But every time we've had an 8 o'clock service and free donuts, we have a good crowd. So just think about that. If this is the only service you can come to, that's fine. But we find a lot of people who typically don't come to church come about this time of the day. So consider that. Secondly, if by chance you haven't been able to watch the Brad Gray seminar, he did it Sunday night a week ago at 6 p.m., The Restoration of All Things. It fits so well into the series we're doing. It is a brilliant 2-hour-long presentation of the entire Bible and how the timeline fits together. And so if you are a novice with the Bible, I think you will find it unbelievably helpful. But if you're a veteran, you'll also find it like, wow, okay, that helps me so much. So if you get a chance, I'd encourage you to watch that. It'll be on our website. So our series is Threads. We're looking at these big meta-narratives that are woven throughout thousands of years of Scripture. And here's what we're going to focus on today. It's going to be the idea of a priest. And you're introduced to the idea of priesthood in the second book of the Bible. It carries through, it has overlays with the person of Jesus, and then some New Testament modern day applications as well. Okay, priests are, they're kind of universal when it comes to different, even religious groups. It's the idea that there's someone who has a unique relationship with God and then functions in a representative fashion to the masses. Okay, so I think this illustration will help us. If these are the masses, this is us, this is just normal people. Well, you've got God over here, and we've learned from Genesis chapter 3 that there's been a chasm created because of human rebellion, and so there's this distance between us and God. And so one of the things that God instituted is he said, okay, here's what we'll do because of the chasm. We'll create an intermediary, somebody who can be a representative. They'll stand between God and people, and they'll represent in two different ways. One is they'll have a unique relationship with God. They've got unique access. And they'll hear God, and they'll try to understand the ways of God, and then they'll represent God to people as a whole. But they'll represent the other way as well. The people who feel distant from God would say to the priest, these are our challenges, these are our fears, this is what is unsettling to us. So the priest would take those things and then represent them to God. So this all begins after the people of Israel have been slaves for 4 centuries. They're coming out of the wilderness. They're going to live this nomadic lifestyle. And here's point number 1. We're introduced to a man named Aaron, and Aaron is the first priest. The first priest. Now, who's Aaron? I want to talk a little bit about him. Aaron is Moses' brother. So when Moses, grew up in Egypt as a prince, and then tries to deliver the people, fails, spends 40 years wandering. God says, come back. God says, I'm going to have you deliver the people. And Moses is filled with feelings of inadequacy, like massive. You can read about this in Exodus chapter 3. He says, I'm not verbally gifted. I'm kind of shy. I feel inadequate. So God says this, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you your brother Aaron, and he will function as the first priest. He will help you represent God to the people and the people to God. And so Aaron is the first high priest. Let's talk a little bit about this. What does that mean? I have 2 passages of scripture I want to read from the 3rd and then the 2nd book of the Bible to help us understand what a priest was. The first one is from Leviticus chapter 9. Then Aaron lifted his hands towards the people and blessed them. Okay, this speaks a little bit about his role of on behalf of God. He's lifting his hands, blessing the people, and having sacrificed the sin offering, the burnt offering, and the fellowship offering, he stepped down. So in this role, one of the things he did is, here's the people, here's where we're at, and we've made mistakes and we have failure that just courses through us. And so they would say to Aaron, Aaron, would you help us in our relationship with God? So Aaron would move towards God and would sacrifice on behalf of the people. So it's this intercessory role where he's saying, hey, God, people have made mistakes. I'm approaching you. Would you forgive them? So he works in that role. Now, there's another passage I want to read, and we could read dozens of passages that have to do with the priests. But this one gives us a little idea on who they are and what they're doing. This is from Exodus 40. God says, bring Aaron and his sons to the entrance of the tent of meeting. I'll pause there for a moment. So in these 40 years where Israel's nomadic, okay, after they leave Egypt, the one thing that they have that they take with them wherever it is called the Tabernacle. What it is a temporary temple, right? So it can be packed up, loaded onto carts, loaded on animals' backs, but it's this series of different entrances and like closer and closer to God, and eventually there's this holy place where no one can go. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But this is like the place, it's like that sense that human beings, Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2, we were meant to walk with God, but we've been pushed out of his presence. The tabernacle is the sense that God is still in our midst and we can still know him. So he has Aaron meet here at the tabernacle and wash them with water. So whenever you read about a priest, there's always this ritualistic washing that needs to happen. It's this word consecrated, which we'll read in a moment, where a priest, because they had this unique job to go towards God, they just needed to make sure that they were in good standing with God before they did it. So they did these ceremonial washings, they did sacrifices for their own failures, and then they moved towards God. We'll move on. And then dress Aaron in the sacred garments. We're gonna talk about that in a moment, and they're not underwear, okay? They're these sacred garments. Anoint him and consecrate him. So anoint. There's this thread throughout the Bible that when somebody has a unique role to play, they would take olive oil, which was really precious to them, and it's been highly refined, so it represented purity, and they would pour the oil on someone's head. And so they bring Aaron, and they pour this oil, and it's the sign that God is coming upon you. He's empowering you for this unique role. So anoint him and consecrate, meaning set him apart. He can't be involved in base things. He's specifically assigned to a really unique task so that he may serve me as priest, bring his sons and dress them in tunics. Anoint them just as you anointed their father so they may serve me as priests. Their anointing will be to a priesthood that will continue throughout their generations. So here's what happens moving forward. This is thousands of years ago. There's always a priest. God is eventually going to employ a tribe of Israel known as the Levites. And the Levites come in and they spend about a month every year serving in a priest-like capacity. But it's Aaron and it's his descendants, and they serve as the priest, this intermediary between God and between us as the masses. And they serve, they do whatever they can to represent God, to represent the people to God, all of these beautiful things. They have two main jobs, okay? One is they're called to minister to God, which is a little bit of a funny phrase. But they come and they say, God, here's where we are. We worship you. We surrender to you. And then they're called to minister to the people, to bring comfort, to bring direction. Now, to help us understand this, this is an artist's rendering, and there's no perfect example, but this is fairly accurate as far as we can tell biblically. So the priest wore garb that would be very similar to this. So everything is unique. It's all got patterns. It all has meaning. But I want to focus on this right here. It is a breastplate, and the Bible calls it an ephod, okay? And here's what's on this ephod, because it tells us what a priest was all about. There's 3 rows of 4 stones. This is actually where we get the whole idea of birthstones. If you're born in a certain month, you are assigned with this stone. every one of these stones represented one of the 12 tribes of Israel. And so the priest, when he's ready to do his duty, he puts this ephod on. And I just want you to think of the significance of this. You are taking, this is the tribe of Benjamin and Judah, you are taking the people, you wear them on your heart. You carry them. And so when the priest puts on the ephod and he moves towards God, he is bringing representations of the people before God. And when he moves towards the people, he's saying, I've been wearing this in the presence of God and I move towards you. You cannot see this in this representation, but on either shoulder are two stones. They're black onyx, okay, onyx. And on the right shoulder, in this onyx stone, are engraved 6 of the tribes of Israel. And on the left shoulder are engraved the other 6 tribes of Israel. So again, another weighty representation is you carry the people before God. And then inside of this is very mysterious, two stones called the Urim and the Thummim. Okay, say that fast. Urim and the Thummim. And we don't know a lot about this, but one of the things that the priest was supposed to do is he was supposed to give direction and decipher the will of God to the people. And so we don't know a lot about how it operated, but we do know that there's no written documents regarding who God is and what his ways are. This is all before that. So the priest would take out the Urim and the Thummim, which are contained in this ephod, and he would either hold them up to his forehead, it's a little bit debated, or actually to his eyes, these 2 stones. And as he looked through them, he would be able to decipher the ways of God. Do not try this at home. Okay, we don't have to do that any longer. But here's what the priest did is like, I've got to hear God and I've got to pass it on to the people. I carry the weight of the people upon me. I represent them to God. Now, another aspect of the priest is he had access to God like nobody else did. Really unique access. And so he could move past, in this whole tabernacle scenario, there's several like curtains and you can't go any farther, but the priest had access to move as close to God as possible, except for there's one place where he's not allowed to go except for one time a year. And that is into the holiest place where the Ark of the Covenant is. And there's a significant curtain that separates the two. But one day, out of 365, on the Day of Atonement, the priest was allowed to go into the holiest place, which represented where God was. Now, he's also warned that if you come into my presence and you come in an unworthy fashion, you will die. Privilege and a little nerve-wracking, right? You're like walking through the last year. Okay, what else might I have done? What else might I have done? So in extra biblical writings, some of the rabbinical teachings, we're told that they were so concerned about the priest dropping dead this one day a year that they tied a string of bells on his waist and also onto his shoes. And onto his right leg, they would attach a long rope that ran outside. And so this was the concern. Like if the priest went into the holiest place and he dropped dead, how do you get him out? Because anybody else who goes in is going to drop dead, right? So when the bells stopped ringing, they'd be like, hello? No answer. You just pulled him out by the rope. Okay? But he has this unique access to God. So here's the idea of a priest, and he functions, but there's a problem. And you can imagine what the problem is. If you have God here, you have all of us, masses of people, and somebody in between. Here's the problem. Priests are incredibly susceptible to pride. They're susceptible to leveraging their power for personal gain. In fact, if you read the latter prophets towards the end of the Old Testament, a great deal of warnings are directed specifically to the priests. Things like, you've taken advantage of your position. You've tried to become wealthy off of a task that I have given you. You have become prideful. And so, although this is an ideal spot, it's no human being could be a perfect priest because power corrupts, doesn't it? Influence corrupts. And he said, you're not carrying the people. You're supposed to represent them. And so you have this semi-working, semi-functioning office of priest. Now, let's jump forward a few thousand years. When Jesus comes to planet Earth, there is a priesthood happening. And now instead of a tabernacle, they've actually built a temple. It's the second temple. And we know one of the priests during the life of Jesus, his name was Caiaphas, okay? And Jesus comes into this whole reality, and through his death and resurrection, there's this really poignant statement that the writer of the book of Hebrews says, bringing Jesus into this thread of priests. And he's gonna propose this. This is point number 2, that Jesus is now the great high priest. Jesus is now the great high priest. Let's read from Hebrews chapter 4, because it just does a brilliant job of setting out this idea and this argument, this idea that we needed someone besides a human being, a corrupt human being who would always fail, who would tend towards selfishness, all of these things. This is what Hebrews chapter 4 says. Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, meaning that when Jesus went up, all work was done, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith that we profess. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses. Pause there for a moment. So Hebrews says this. Okay, if we're in the masses, none of us were from the tribe of Aaron. We didn't meet the genetic qualifications. Here was the challenge, is you could go to the priest and you could say, hey, I'm struggling. I struggle with fear. I struggle with addictive tendencies. I struggle with pride. I struggle with falsifying my life. I struggle with putting up a mask of all these things. They're just real struggles in my life. Here's what could happen. This priest who lived a different life, right, insulated and isolated, could look at you and say, hey, pull it together. Why do you keep doing those same things? Quit failing, do more, try harder. Here's what Hebrews says. If Jesus is now the high priest, he empathizes with our weakness. Or whatever vulnerabilities and weakness that you or I have in our lives. Rather than being disdainful or angry or frustrated, Jesus has empathy. He knows what it's like. He knows what it's like to tend towards addictive behavior. He knows what it's like. He empathizes when I am fragile, when I am governed by fear rather than courage, when I lack peace. He understands. There is an empathy coming from Jesus into humanity. And the author goes on to say this, but we have one high priest who has been tempted in every way just as we are, yet he did not sin. So Hebrews sets it up this way, that here's Jesus as the priest. He sees us, and Jesus actually lived a human life. Sometimes we get this fanciful idea in our minds that, Jesus, he wasn't a real person. He was a real human being, the God-man. And as a real human being, he faced every temptation that you and I face. So here we are, we're dealing with it's sexual temptation. It's a temptation to cheat, to cut corners, whatever it might be. This is what the writer of Hebrews says. He empathizes with you, and he has been tempted in every way that you could possibly be tempted. And you might say, well, hey, my temptation is with some modern drug, right? It's meth. Meth wasn't created 2,000 years ago. But the writer of Hebrews says, Jesus knows what it's like to have pain and try to numb the pain. He knows what it's like. I think there's no way out for me, so I have to escape. That there is this empathy and this compassion that flows from Jesus. He's now the one standing between us and God. And here's what's key. Yet he did not sin. He did not sin. He faced what you and I faced, but he did not sin. So he can coach us through. He can tell us how to move forward. Let's go on to read a little bit more. Let us then approach God's throne of grace. Okay, so here the author is setting up. Remember, everybody's over here. He brings everyone up. He says, Jesus is now your high priest. You can come up and stand with him, and let us approach the throne of grace with confidence. Confidence. How scared would you have been if you were the high priest on the Day of Atonement and you were walking into the Holy of Holies and you weren't sure whether or not you're going to be struck dead? Here's what Hebrews says. Because of Jesus, because of what he did, he's now the high priest. He says, move forward with me, and I want you to actually approach God's throne, not with trepidation, not with fear, not with sense of I'm so inadequate, what's gonna happen to me? He goes, you can move towards God because of the work of Jesus as the high priest with confidence so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. You and I get to move towards God, towards holy, sacred spaces with confidence. And when you're in need, what you find there with God is not rejection, is not blame, is not anger, is not wrath, but you find what? Mercy and grace. Mercy and grace. So the writer of Hebrews brings up this brand new idea that Jesus is now the high priest. The other high priest, Aaron and his descendants, they did the best they could, but they were failed human beings. Now, Hebrews says, step forward with the high priest. You now have access to God. You now have grace and mercy in your time of need. Now, it doesn't just end there. There's one more way that this thread weaves through. And this particularly comes from the Apostle Peter. The Apostle Peter, this is one of the last books written in the New Testament. And Peter presents this idea. This is the third big idea. It's that the followers of Jesus are also priests. Okay, he puts this big, bold idea out there that the followers of Jesus are also priests. Now, remember, there's only one or two people in the world who can be a priest. You had to be from the right line of people, genetically, you had to be consecrated, set apart. And here's what Peter's gonna do. He goes, now all of you are chosen, now all of you are holy, now all of you are consecrated, so step forward into this place of being a representative of God, right? Two passages of scripture. One, you're gonna think, how's that related? But we gotta read it because it's almost Easter, and then we're gonna move to 1 Peter. So one of the first times this is presented is in the book of Matthew, and this is at the moment when Jesus dies. He cries out, makes his last declaration to God, like it's finished, it's all over. And this is what Matthew says. At that moment, the moment when Jesus dies, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. So here's this thought. Okay, what curtain are we talking about? We're talking about the curtain that exists in the Jewish temple that separates the Holy of Holies, the sacred place, from everyone else. The curtain that only one person once a year could get through. And how's it torn? From top to bottom. This is a curtain that is about 3 1/4 inches thick and about 47 feet tall. It's bigger than the ceiling up here. And when Jesus dies, one of the initial things that happens is this curtain is ripped in two. From top to bottom, God initiates the ripping. Now, what does that mean? I think it means a couple of things. One is this, every human being is so distant from God, God's saying, I open up relationship. I tear it up. But Jesus, what my son just did now means that you can step forward towards God to be in harmony with your Creator once again. And I also think it means this. It means God saying, I'm stepping out. No longer do you find me in some isolated Holy of Holies, but I am now present with my people. It's part of the work of Jesus. So this idea like the masses move up, you can step into the holy place, into relationship with God. Now, I also want to read from 1 Peter because Peter just elaborates on this in this brilliant way. But you are a chosen people, okay? Aaron was chosen. He uses the same word, a Greek equivalent of a Hebrew word. You were chosen. Who's he writing to? Just a bunch of everyday normal people. You are a chosen people, a royal priesthood. Not just a priest, but royal, meaning your daughters with the king. Your sons are the king of the universe, and a holy nation, God's special possession that you may declare. So why are you chosen? Why are you a priest? So that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Now, this idea is unbelievably exciting, because here's what we tend to do. We tend to still think in terms of priesthood. Okay, that there's somebody, maybe in your imagery or somebody online that you follow, or you come to this church and it's me, is you think that I stand between you and God in some unique way. Here's what I love about this. There is absolutely nothing that I can do to grant you access to God's presence. I cannot help you. No pastor can help you. Because the priesthood is gone. The veil has been torn in two. Now, there's a whole nother new leadership dynamic called pastors where we serve, but I can't do anything. I don't have to represent you before God. I don't wear an ephod. Anybody notice that? Why? Because the 12 stones that represent the 12 tribes can now walk in. They don't have to have some intermediary between them and God. So there's no more that's my job is to represent you, because you can walk right towards God. You can be his hands and feet. You are priests. So Martin Luther, somebody you hear his name a lot, 16th century, he's one of the fathers of the Reformation. He grasped this. In fact, probably at the core of his theology is this idea of the priesthood of all believers. So he's been a Catholic priest for just about 5 years, and he's never read the New Testament. So did you know the Bible, until Luther and some of the other reformers, was only written in Latin because Latin was the sacred text, and very few people knew Latin. In fact, only priests could actually read the book, and there was this whole thing that was developed in the church called the magisterium. The magisterium is the teaching arm of the church. And so they took this job very seriously, like the Urim and the Thummim is, our job is to tell people who God is. Our job is to read the text and interpret it and then give it to them. And here's what Luther says. Luther, actually there's a diary entry the first day he read the New Testament. In his diary entry he says this: "Today I encountered a strange new world." It was the New Testament. He'd never read it before. And he walks away with this profound understanding of what Peter says. He's part of the system. He is a priest. And he realizes, I think I'm actually inhibiting people from experiencing God because Jesus is the high priest and they can all step forward instead of staying back there. And so he does this crazy, audacious thing, and the church leaders decide they're gonna kill him for it. Guess what he does? He translates the Bible from Latin into common German. And they're like, how dare you? Because the magisterium says no, only a few people can read the Bible. And he goes, actually, I'm gonna put it into dialects that are just common, rough dialects. You read this yourself. And the church begins to access the scriptures. The church begins to realize, wait a minute. The system of God's there and people are there and somebody has to be there on your behalf is over with, because now Jesus stands here, and so we're all in this place, and it's step forward, move towards God. You're holy, you're consecrated, you're set apart. You have an assignment to declare the praises of him who brought you from darkness into his new and eternal light. So what does this mean for us today? I think it just has unbelievably profound implications on daily living in the year 2022. Some of us, I would say, how we were raised, understanding of leadership, we love God, right? We're in the process. But we still feel like there's this distance and that somebody, some spiritual leader, needs to represent me. And we're like overwhelmed at times with fear, anxiety, guilt, and we don't feel worthy to move towards God because of what we've done. If that's where you find yourself at times, let this text seep into you. Because here's the truth. Jesus came. He fulfilled what no human being had ever been able to fulfill. He becomes the great high priest. And he looks at us and he says, come on. Don't stand distant from God. Move forward and now approach God's throne. The veil's been ripped in two. I ripped it through my death. And I want you to find mercy and I want you to find grace and I want you to come to God with confidence that what I did upon the cross forgave you. You no longer have to be overwhelmed by feelings of inadequacy. And then he says, you were a priest. And then here's the second part. When Christianity, raw, true Christianity is at its best, it's when people realize that they are priests and priestesses of God. When they're not looking to a few religious professionals to do a job for them, but they are saying, I've stepped forward. And okay, you're not gonna put on an ephod, all right? If you go to work tomorrow with an ephod, people are gonna be like, what are you doing? Like, I'm a priest of Jesus Christ. It's not gonna work, it's not gonna work. But you wanna carry people. You move into the role of representative, that I know God, I've approached his throne. And then I also know that there's the people that I work with in the neighborhood that I live in and the students that I go to school with. And I am in this role of representing, of showing who my king is, of helping them understand how profound his love is. So there's still this representative role. And somebody says, could that be true? And you say, yeah, it's true. Come on in and be a priest of God. When the church embraces their identity of priests, they realize, I can figure out who God is as the Spirit of God tutors me. I can do the work of Jesus. If you want to know what a priest looks like, a New Testament priest, read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the biographies of the life of Jesus. Here's what a priest does. They walk with boldness with their Father. They follow. They move towards human tragedy and pain. They deal with darkness. They bring hope. They tell people who thought they could never be forgiven that they're forgiven. That's what it means to live as a priest in our world today.